The manager froze in panic. But then, the janitor stepped forward. What happened next shocked the entire room. The city never really slept. The glass towers stood tall, their windows glowing like watchful eyes in the early hours of the morning. Among them was the headquarters of Grantwell Industries, a place that hummed with ambition, power, and money. Inside its polished marble lobby, men and women in suits strutted about, each carrying a sense of importance. Titles mattered here. Appearances mattered here. And yet, in this temple of wealth and prestige, there was one man nobody truly noticed. His name was David Carter. David wore a gray janitor's uniform, one that always smelled faintly of disinfectant and bleach. His work boots squeaked softly against the tile floors as he pushed his mop bucket down the hallways. To most of the employees, he was invisible. At best, he was background noise. At worst, he was a target for mockery. Managers passed him without so much as a nod. Secretaries sometimes whispered cruelly behind his back, joking about his endless mop routine. And if an executive happened to spill coffee, they wouldn't even look him in the eye as they ordered him to clean it up. But David never complained. He never raised his voice. He simply smiled politely and went about his work. What they didn't know, what no one in that building had ever bothered to ask, was that David Carter carried a secret. A talent so remarkable it could shake the very foundations of Grantwell Industries. It all began on Monday morning, a day that seemed ordinary at first. David arrived early, as always, unlocking the supply closet and checking his list for the day. He liked mornings, when the building was quiet and the sun spilled across the marble like liquid gold. He would mop the floors, wipe down glass panels, and hum softly to himself. But this day was different. As David wheeled his cart toward the elevators, he overheard a heated conversation between two managers. "They're saying Alistair Grantwell himself is flying in," one of them whispered, her heels clicking as she rushed past. "What? The CEO? That man hasn't stepped foot in this office in years," the other replied, adjusting his tie nervously. "Exactly. He's coming with investors from Shanghai. It's going to be a huge meeting. If we screw this up," her voice trailed off. David froze for a moment, his hand tightening on the mop handle. Alistair Grantwell. Even janitors like him knew that name. Billionaire, tycoon, ruthless negotiator. Some called him a genius, others a shark. David tilted his head. Shanghai, they had said. So this was about China. He smiled faintly to himself, though no one was around to see it. As the morning wore on, the tension inside the building grew thicker. Executives shuffled papers nervously, secretaries rehearsed greetings. The managers who normally mocked David seemed far too distracted to notice him today. They whispered about contracts, profit margins, and negotiations. By noon, the air itself seemed electric. And then, he arrived. The billionaire himself, Alistair Grantwell, walked through the glass doors surrounded by assistants. He was tall, sharp-featured, with silver hair brushed neatly back. His presence alone commanded silence. Conversations died. Employees froze, then straightened their backs. "Mr. Grantwell, welcome, sir," one of the senior managers rushed forward, nearly tripping over his own shoes in his eagerness. Alistair gave only a curt nod, his piercing blue eyes scanning the lobby. He didn't waste time on small talk. Instead, he gestured toward the boardroom. "Let's begin." Everyone followed like nervous schoolchildren. Everyone except David. David remained at the far end of the hall, his mop resting in the bucket. Yet he could hear the shuffle of expensive shoes, the hushed voices, and the creak of the boardroom door as it closed. He sighed softly, returning to his work. But he kept an ear open. Inside the boardroom, a storm was brewing. The managers laid out charts and presentations, their voices trembling ever so slightly. They spoke of numbers, of markets, of opportunity. Alistair listened without a word, his expression unreadable. And then he leaned back in his chair and said something. Not in English, not in French, but in Mandarin Chinese. The words flowed out of his mouth like a test, sharp and precise, and silence followed. The managers froze, their faces paled. Not one of them understood him. "Did he just," one whispered. "Oh my God, what did he say?" another muttered. Alistair's expression hardened. His eyes flicked across the room, searching for comprehension. The investors from Shanghai, seated across the table, raised their brows in expectation. But none of the managers answered. Sweat trickled down foreheads, papers rustled nervously. One of the vice presidents coughed, trying to cover the humiliation. Alistair leaned forward, repeating the question in Mandarin, this time more slowly, more deliberately. Still nothing. The managers looked at one another, panicked. They had prepared spreadsheets and fancy slides, but not one of them had bothered to learn even a word of the language their investors spoke. The silence grew unbearable. And then, from the corner of the room, came the sound of a throat clearing. Soft, steady, confident. Every head turned. It was David. The janitor, standing by the door with his mop in hand, his uniform wrinkled, his boots scuffed. He wasn't supposed to be in there. He had only stepped in to empty the trash. But now every eye was on him. And, in flawless, fluent Mandarin, he spoke. Mr. Grantwell just asked whether the Shanghai partners believed the proposed timeline was acceptable or if additional accommodations were necessary. The room went silent again. But this silence was different. This was shock. The investors from Shanghai widened their eyes. Alistair's brows arched slightly. The managers, every single one of them, stared at David as if they'd grown a second head. The janitor, the man they ignored, the man they mocked, had just answered in perfect Chinese. And in that instant, David Carter stopped being invisible. He had just revealed a secret no one saw coming. And the story had only just begun. The boardroom was frozen in silence. It was the kind of silence that seemed to stretch forever, the kind that pressed against your chest and made the air feel heavier. Every executive, every secretary, even the assistants holding their tablets, all of them stared at David like they'd just seen the impossible. For years, David had been the man in the background, the janitor with the mop, the man who spoke little, moved quietly, and blended into the wallpaper of the company's glittering halls. But now, here he was, speaking flawless Mandarin Chinese, in a calm, confident voice. The investors from Shanghai exchanged looks with one another, then one of them leaned forward and said something quickly, in Chinese. His words were fast, precise, and heavy with business jargon. Without missing a beat, David responded in Mandarin, smooth, measured, respectful, the kind of response that belonged to a professional interpreter, not a janitor in a stained uniform. Gasps echoed through the room. The managers who had mocked him felt their throats go dry. One of them fumbled with a pen, dropping it on the table. Another kept glancing at Alistair Grantwell, as if to praying that all this was just a dream. But Alistair wasn't shocked, not in the way they expected. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. His piercing blue eyes studied David with something rare. Curiosity. "Mr. Carter, is it?" Alistair asked finally in English, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. David hesitated. He wasn't used to being addressed in these meetings. In fact, he wasn't supposed to even be in them. Yet here he stood, all eyes on him. "Yes, sir," David replied, his voice respectful but steady. "You speak Mandarin," Alistair said, though it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," David answered again. "I lived in Beijing for several years." The shockwaves rippled again. Employees exchanged bewildered glances. Beijing? The janitor had lived in Beijing? One of the managers, red-faced with embarrassment, tried to interject, "Mr. Grantwell, if you'll allow me, perhaps we should bring in a professional interpreter." But Alistair cut him off with a single raised hand. "No need," he said, his gaze never leaving David. "We already have one." The investors smiled faintly, clearly impressed. For the first time since entering the building, they leaned forward with genuine interest. And just like that, the entire dynamic of the meeting shifted. For the next hour, David stood quietly at the side of the room, translating seamlessly. Every word from the investors flowed through him, Every response from Alistair carried flawlessly across the language barrier. He knew the nuances, the idioms, the cultural layers behind each phrase. The executives tried to regain their composure, but it was too late. The truth hung in the air like a thundercloud. The janitor was more valuable than all of them. The managers who had laughed at him before now sat rigid, their faces stiff with a mix of humiliation and fear. Their pride had been cracked open, exposing the ugly truth. They had underestimated him. They had dismissed him. And now, in front of the most powerful man in the room, their ignorance was undeniable. At one point, one of the investors chuckled and asked David a question directly. "In Beijing, where did you live?" he asked in Mandarin. David smiled faintly, his eyes softening at the memory.